On today's SUPI tutorial, what we're going to be talking about is how to make this cursor. So as we move our cursor around the page, we get this almost oval effect as we move around in different directions. And also when we hover over images, we get some text appear. So how do we go about making this effect? So there's two parts to this. First one is making a trail that follows around us, and the second one is making some text appear. And my example will look like this. So as I move around, mine's a little bit slower just so we can see it. When we hover an image, we'll get some text appear. So to do this, we're going to be using two different effects. This actually extends one of our previous tutorials called Smooth Movements with JavaScript. So if you're not comfortable with some of this stuff, go and watch this video first, but we'll talk about how to make this effect using CSS and JavaScript. So the first thing that I've done in this tutorial is I've just set up a basic website. So here what we have is just a normal web page. We've got some images with some text on each side. And in here I've got three different sections. One section with an image. In here we've got a div tag which kind of holds these two things together, this header and paragraph on each one. So essentially I've just got three section tags here. So no cursor effect moving at the moment. Now what I want to do is have some kind of ball follow me around this page. So what I'm going to do in my HTML is right at the bottom, I'm just going to make a new area. So what I want to do is essentially have some balls kind of chase me around the page. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a div tag, and let's give this div tag a name, a class of cursors. Now we're calling it cursors because technically we're going to have multiple things following us on this page. Now within this cursors, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another div tag. Now this div tag is just going to be empty. There's no content in this. This is all for style reasons. So I'm just going to remove the space for now. Now essentially what I want this empty tag to look like is basically a red ball. So what I'm going to quickly do is go into my style.css. Now to style this up, what I'm going to say is I have this div with a class of cursors, and then inside this, using a space, I have another div tag which is currently empty, and this I want to add some style to this. Now currently we don't see it anywhere on the page because it's empty, there's no text inside of it, it has no style. So let's start to add some style. We're going to add a position absolute, and let's just place it for the moment in the top position, something like 300 and left 300. So it will be around about here, 300 from the top and left. So we can't see it at the moment because it's no style. Let's give it a width and height. So we'll give it a width 32 and a height of 32. Still can't see it. So we can't see it because it has no background, it has no text. So let's just give it a background color. So the background color I'm going to give it is just a red color that I picked. So we can see this red square start to appear. Now I want this to be a circle. So rather than a square, let's give it some rounded edges. Let's make it have a border radius. Let's give it something like 50%. So now it's round. So with this as well, what we want to do is make this go over everything. So because this is using position absolute, if we have anything else that has position absolute on the page, just want to make sure that this cursor goes above it with a Z index. So Z index, just going to make it a pretty high number, 10,000 for now. Now the other thing we need to consider is as we move our cursor around, what we want to do is make sure that the circle itself doesn't get in the way of anything that we click. So what we're going to just quickly add is pointer events is none. So if I'm going around and there's a link on this page and I want to click it, this actual div tag which does follow me around doesn't get in the way. Now the other thing that I want to do is basically make this follow us around the page, and the only way that we can do that is using a bit of JavaScript. At the moment we have no scripts in our page. What we're going to do is we're going to add our first script, cursors.js. So this is going to be just an empty script at the moment. We're not adding it to our web page just yet. So we need to hook these things together. In my index.html, after I've got my cursor set up, I want to run some script. So I'm going to run a script tag, and the script tag has a source, src, equal to cursors.js. So anything that we've just made in this file will run on this page. What do we want to do on this page? Well, what we want to say is this ball, or multiple balls, want to follow us around the page. So how do we do this? So back in my cursors.js, the first thing I'm going to do is actually I'm going to pick from my index.html this kind of like parent tag, all of this stuff. So first thing I'm going to do is have a constant called cursor tag. And this is equal to, in my document, I'm going to select, using a query selector, div.cursors. So this is going to select this tag around here. But the next thing what we want to do is get this div tag from here. So let's get this one inside this div class cursors. Underneath here, we're going to have a constant called ball. And this is going to be equal to, well, not the document, we can actually get it based on this cursor tag dot query selector, and in here, div. So this is the same as doing div.cursors space div. What we want to do with this next is basically have this move around the page. So the quick way to do this would be essentially say, whenever we move our mouse cursor, be in that position. So just to do this quick version, I'm going to say document.add event listener. What do we want to listen out for? Well, any kind of mouse movement, mouse move. When we do this, we're going to run a function, round brackets, curly brackets. Now I'm going to open these curly brackets out just to make this easier to read. But with this function, I can also get what has happened here. So this is add event listener. I want to basically get some information from what has just happened, the event. So I'm going to pass this in with the word event. Now this could be called E or EV, doesn't really matter. We can call this whatever we want, but we're not using this in our code at the moment. Now, if we wanted to use this in our code, what we could say is this ball could be the exact same position as the mouse. To do this, we're going to say ball.style.left. Let's do left first. And this is going to be equal to this event that we've just been passing in. Where are we on the page? What we can get from this event is page X. And we need to add to this pixels, so we know that we're moving around. So now if I move my cursor around, up and down, it'll go across the page. But what we want to do is move it up and down as well. So not only do we want to move it left, we also want to move it from the top. So underneath here, we're going to do style on the ball equal to page event Y in pixels, and this will also now follow us around. Now, one thing you might notice is the ball isn't in the center, it's in the top left corner, and that's because we use left and top. Now, to kind of just counteract this, we're just going to go into our style sheet. In here, what we can say is move this whole ball kind of up, shift it over by 50% across and up. To do this, we're going to do transform with translate. We're going to say minus 50%, minus 50%. So this will be exactly now in the middle. So this is how we do things for just one ball. But what we want to do is basically make this kind of not follow instantly. It kind of feels a bit too tight. How do we make it between things? How do we make it go between this point? And if I move my mouse cursor, we go towards that. So to do this, based on this kind of previous tutorial that I talked about before, what we're going to have is a different thing. Instead, what we want to do is animate this. This is kind of moving instantly. We want to animate this. So we're going to make a new constant here called animate. And this is going to be a function, round brackets, curly brackets. What we want to do is basically animate this towards where this position is going to end up. So to do this, before we add anything into this const animate, we're going to basically hold where we are in space and where we should go to. So where we currently are, let current x equal 0. And we'll also let current y equal 0 too. But then we'll also have a let aim x equal 0 and a let aim y equal 0. So at the moment, what we have when we move around the page is current x and aim x are exactly the same point. We are basically following along. What we want to do is make it go between the two. Now, what we want to do when we move our mouse is say, this is where we should be going towards. So instead of this code, what we're going to say instead is we're going to get rid of this for aim x is equal to event.page x. This is where we're trying to aim towards. And aim y is going to be event page y. At the moment, this doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is we've just broken a few things. But what we're saying here is when we're having this kind of movement, we're saying this is still 0, but this is now updated. What we want to do is go between the two. So to go between the two, whenever we animate, what we want to do is say, get a bit between this and this, and kind of go between the two. So to do this, we're going to say current x. We're going to add a little bit to this. What do we want to add to this? The difference between the two. So we're going to say aim x minus current x. So the difference between the two times by some kind of speed. Now we don't have a speed just yet, hence why this doesn't work. So up here, we're going to do let speed equal to, let's do a small number, 0.01. Now again, this doesn't do anything because we're just updating variables here. We want to do this with y as well. So same thing. We're going to do aim y and current y times speed. Now this animate function is never run at all. We're holding it but never doing anything with it. So how do we do something with this? Well, first thing we want to do is run it. So underneath, we're going to do animate. But you might notice this doesn't do anything at the moment. If I move my mouse, nothing happens. And that's because 1, this is still using variables, and 2, this only runs once. So how do we make this run every single frame of the page? To use something called request animation frame. So what we're saying here is when we run it on load, wait for the next frame to run, and then what we want to do on the next frame is run animate again. So every single time when we load the page, we run this every single frame. So 60 frames a second pretty much. But again, this isn't moving. Now the reason it's not moving is because we're not moving this ball tag. So underneath here, we can say ball.style.left. And this is equal to, starting to move now, is equal to current x plus px. And the style.top is equal to the current y plus px. So what we'll see now is this kind of goes between these 2 points. So we're using this kind of idea of tweening to go between where I currently am as a ball and where my mouse currently is. Now if I can speed this up, of course I can change this number as well. If I make this number higher, this will move a lot quicker towards the cursor, which kind of makes sense. So how do I get this kind of trail effect going on? Well, at the moment I just have one ball that I'm moving around, this div, and this div is in here. If I add multiple divs though, what I can get is this kind of same effect. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy this and paste it underneath, basically giving myself a lot more balls, which is something I thought I wouldn't say in a tutorial, but now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Let's do 12. There we go. Now this is how many balls that we have, but this is only going to work for the first one. And the reason why it only works for the first one is back in our code, this query selector is just selecting one thing. So instead of this being ball, singular, what I want it to be, a balls. But that doesn't do anything in our code, it just changes the variable name. What we can do instead is change this to query selector all. Now this will give us a list rather than a single thing, which breaks a few things. But essentially what I want to do is still have the same aim, but each of these balls is going to have a different current because they're going to be at different places at different times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take aim X and aim Y, and this is my general one. So I'm going to put it up here. But where I have this code from here to here, from current X to animate, I want it to do this for every single ball. So here what I'm going to say is balls dot for each. For each ball, what do I want to do? Well, I want to run this code to animate each individual ball. I'm going to give each ball a name. I'm going to call it ball. And this does some code. So arrow and then curly brackets. I'm going to open these curly brackets out. And essentially, I'm going to take this let current X and speed, and I'm going to cut it out and paste inside here. And the same thing for animate. I'm going to take this out, I'm going to cut it out and put it inside these curly brackets and then indent it in the same way. So what we'll get now is the same code, except we're doing it for 12 different balls, each doing the same thing. So what I'll get now is the same as what happened before. And the reason for that is all of these 12 balls are running at the same speed. But what I can do is around this balls for each. For each is basically given to us by JavaScript on an array or a list of things. And for each one, the first thing it gives us is the thing in that list. But with this, what we can also pass in is if we put some round brackets around this, we can also pass in comma, an index. Now an index is what number in the list. So if you're in a queue, going to the supermarket, if you're in a queue, you'll be the first or second or third in the list, but obviously you'll be a person. But what we can do now is use this index, what number we are in this list, to change the speed. So I'm going to keep this speed here, but also using this number now, I can say take away index. Now this will be quite a big number, so it'll kind of almost do the opposite. So we're going to take this number and multiply it by something like 0.01, something quite small. But what we'll see now is this kind of trail And essentially what is happening is each of these balls are kind of moving at different speeds to give us this kind of effect. Now, of course, what we can do is change some of these numbers to get this looking a little bit nicer. In my final code, what I have is 0.3, and this index is something like 0.015. And I'll get this effect looking like I'm basically like I'm drawing on the page. And this works for any part of the page now. So we've done the first part of what we wanted to do. Next, what we'll talk about is how to add this hover effect in. So now that we've got our trail set up, let's add some text. Now, back in my cursors in my HTML, what I kind of want to do is add some text straight into here. So for instance, if I go into my div tag and say testing 1, 2, 3, I'll get some text kind of follow me around. Now, to make this a little bit easier to kind of play with, I'm actually going to take this testing 1, 2, 3, open this up, and I'm going to put it in a span tag, testing 1, 2, 3. Now, the reason for adding this span tag in is just so it's easier to select. So we can see this testing 1, 2, 3 in here. What I can do now using this span tag is style this up a little bit nicer than what we have right now. So how do we do this? Back in my style.css, I've got my div.cursors space div. And now what I can get is my div.cursors. I've got div tags and now a span tag in here. And in this span tag, what I can start to add in is some style. So on this span tag, I could say position absolute. Now this position absolute is based on this one. So I can say this is position top, still in the same place. But now what I can say is something like left is 40 pixels. So that shifts it over a little bit. I can also give this one maybe a width as well, maybe something like 300 pixels, just so it goes onto one line. There we go. And maybe kind of want some font size on this as well. Font size is 32. Maybe I'll give this some font weight of 700. There we go. Maybe I'll give it some line height as well. Line height of 40. Actually, let's do 32 to make it line up with that. There we go. Maybe I'll give it a color as well. Maybe the same color as above. There we go, looking pretty good. Now, of course, it's not always going to be testing 1, 2, 3. It could be something completely different. So I'm going to get rid of this text. Here we go. And instead, what I want to do on that text is if I hover over any of the images, I want to put that text in there. Now, what text do I want to put in here? It could be very, very different than what I have here, like multi-cursors go everywhere. Now, what I can do is add some hidden text into the page to basically say, show this text. So where do I want to do this? Well, I want to do this when I hover any of these images. So I'm going to scroll up, and in my image tag, I've got this source, which is image.jpg. I've got an alt attribute, which is kind of called pattern. And what I can also do is add a hidden data attribute. So for instance, it could look like data-hover is equal to what should that text be? So I'm going to say pattern number 1. And I'm going to do this for all of these images. Data-hover is pattern number 2. And this one is data-hover pattern number 3. So this is hidden. It's not actually shown on the page. It's actually just an attribute on the image itself. But think of it a little bit like a hook for JavaScript to hold on to. So now what I can do is use this data hover in my JavaScript. So back in my cursors.js, what I need is to get that span tag that I just added into my HTML, which is there, and then get these data hover attributes and say, put this copy into here when we hover. So what we're going to say at the top here is, well, we want to have some kind of constant called ball message. And this is equal to, on this cursor tag, let's do a query selector. There's only one on here, so not query selector all, for this div span. So there's one span tag in here. This is what we want. Now we're not using this at the moment, but we want to get the images as well. So underneath here, we're going to do constant images. And here what we want to do is the document. We're going to do a query selector all, because we want multiple images, img. Now, just to be specific on this, because there could be multiple images on this page, I could also say in here, using square brackets, data-hover, which basically selects any image with this data-hover that we've just added. If there's another image that doesn't include this, this will not be part of that. So in my cursors.js, what I want to do now is go over each one individually, and then when I hover that, replace this ball message with that. So further down on this page, what do we need to do? So we're going to get images, But this is a list at the moment, so we can't do an event directly on this image. So we're going to do dot for each. What do we want to do in this for each? Well, we're going to say each individual thing does something. What do we want to call each individual thing? Call it image, call it whatever we want. And this goes and does some code. What do we want to do in this code, in these curly brackets? Well, on this image, I want to add an event listener to each individual one of these images. What do I want to listen out for? Any kind of mouse over. So not mouse hover, because we don't want to do it every single time. We want to do it just when we hover this. What do we want to do when we hover? Well, we want to run a function, round brackets, curly brackets. So what do we want to do in this curly bracket code? So in here, what we can say is, in this ball message, let's change that HTML to be something else. So here we'll do ball message dot inner HTML is equal to testing123 for now. So equal to a string of this. So at the moment, nothing happens until I hover over. Now I don't want it to say testing123. Instead, what I want to do is get each image's data attribute. So instead of this string, I'm going to get rid of this for image dot get attribute, and in round brackets and quote data dash hover. So now what will happen is if I go over this, we'll see pattern 1, but it will stay on pattern 1 as well. If I go on the second one, it will change to pattern 2 and then pattern 3. Now, of course, what I want to do is when I hover off, I want to get rid of that message. So there is two ways to do this. So the first way would be to just add something else. So similar to what we have here, we're going to do this in this loop, image.add event listener. For mouse out, we're going to run a function, round brackets, curly brackets. The ball message, when we hover away in a HTML, is equal to an empty string. We don't need to have anything inside of it when we hover out. So now what we'll get is when we hover over, this will flick to pattern 2. When we hover away, it will disappear. Now there is one other thing that we could do, which is basically say, well, instead of this hover out and kind of disappear instantly, maybe we'll fade it out. So what we're going to do is actually replace this with something else. Instead, what I'm going to say in my cursor, in my style.css, is the span by default, this text is going to be opacity 0. Now, at the moment, I can't see that. So just to kind of prove this in my span, I'm just going to do testing123. And when I hover this, we still can't see testing123 and nothing appears. So it isn't broken yet. But what I can say is if there's a class on this span tag of something like visible, then let's make that opacity 1. So testing123, pattern 2. So opacity 0, but instead underneath here, we're going to say div.cursors, div span dot visible. Now, visible doesn't mean anything. It's just a class that we've kind of added. Now, this isn't doing anything just yet. We'll do opacity 1. But what we can do in our JavaScript now is say, turn this on and off. So in my cursors.js, when I hover over, not only do I want to replace this ball message with what I've just hovered, I also want to see it. So ball message dot class list, we're going to add a new class onto this span tag called visible. And instead of this one, we're going to say ball message class list. We'll remove this span tag visible. So now what we'll get is this will flick on and flick off. It does the same effect. However, now that we have this kind of class in here, what we can do instead is add some transition. So instead of this being 0 directly to 1, we'll add in a CSS transition for the opacity. Let's do half a second just to see it. So now we'll fade in and fade out, fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out. So what we've done now is we've added this style in very, very quickly. We've not got too much content in here. We can get rid of this testing123. So this is all of our cursors, which give us this trail effect. This new span tag we've styled up. This will be where our content lives. And then we've added a little bit of JavaScript that says for each individual image, let's listen to when we do a mouse over. When we do a mouse over, add a class of visible so we can see it. And then let's change that text